The cook stood alone in the kitchen at 4 in the morning staring at 200 metal cups lined up on the counter. The only light in the room came from a single bulb hanging above the stove, and its pale yellow glow caught the surface of every cup, sending tiny reflections across the long wooden table like a field of small cold stars. The air smelled of old grease and dust and the faint ghost of yesterday's bread. But in a few minutes it would smell like coffee, and in 6 hours those 200 cups would be filled and placed on trays and carried to the men who had fought for the country that killed his son. His name was Frank Holloway. He was 45 years old. His hands were steady, his jaw was tight, and in the left breast pocket of his uniform, pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat, was a letter from the War Department. He had folded and unfolded that letter so many times that the creases had nearly torn through the paper, and the words printed at the top, the words that began with, "We regret to inform you," had faded from the sweat of his fingers and the salt of everything he had carried since the day it arrived. But Frank Holloway was about to learn something that no letter, no war, and no amount of grief could have taught him. It started with a single cup of coffee, and it ended with a promise that would outlast them both. To understand how a man who hated his enemy came to stand beside one in the dark before dawn, you need to go back 4 months to a hot afternoon in August of 1943, when the first convoy of German prisoners rolled through the gates of Camp Hearn, Texas. Camp Hearn sat on flat agricultural land about 10 miles southwest of the town of Bryan, in the kind of open Texas country where the sky stretched so wide it made everything beneath it feel small. The camp had been built in a hurry on what used to be farmland, and it still looked like a place that did not quite know what it was. Rows of long wooden barracks stood behind coils of barbed wire. Guard towers rose at each corner, and at the center of the compound, a kitchen building served 3 meals a day to hundreds of men, American guards and their prisoners alike. The prisoners were coming from North Africa. In May of 1943, more than 250,000 German and Italian soldiers had surrendered in Tunisia after the Allied victory there. America suddenly faced a problem no one had fully planned for. Hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers needed to be held somewhere, and that somewhere turned out to be the American heartland. Camps appeared across Texas, across the South, across the plains. Camp Hearn was one of hundreds, but its location in cattle country gave it something the others did not. The German men arriving here, many of whom had never left Europe before, would for the first time in their lives see the open grasslands of Texas rolling to the horizon, smell beef cooking over charcoal, and taste the coffee that they had only heard about through wartime propaganda. But before any of that, there was Frank. Frank Holloway was not a combat soldier. He was a cook. Before the war, he had owned a small diner called Holloway's in the town of Hearn, where he served breakfast every morning, starting at 5 o'clock to ranch hands and railroad workers and anyone else who walked through the door. The place was known for two things. The first was bacon fried crisp on a cast iron skillet, the kind of bacon that cracked when you bit into it and left the taste of salt and smoke on your tongue for the rest of the morning. The second was coffee. Black coffee brewed in a large pot, strong enough that some of the regulars joked you could stand a spoon straight up in the cup and it would not fall over. When the war came, Frank was too old to fight. His son was not. Billy Holloway, 22 years old, had volunteered the week after Pearl Harbor. He was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, and shipped to North Africa in late 1942. Frank did the only thing he knew how to do. He enlisted as a military cook and was assigned by a coincidence that felt like cruelty to Camp Hearn, only 10 minutes from the diner he had closed when he left. The last letter Billy sent arrived on a Tuesday morning in early February of 1943. Frank was in the kitchen pouring coffee for the morning shift when the mail clerk handed it to him. Billy's handwriting was quick and confident, the letters leaning forward as if they were in a hurry to get somewhere. He wrote about the desert, about the dust that got into everything, about the food that was never quite hot enough. And at the end, he wrote one line that Frank would carry with him for the rest of his life. "Everything will be over soon, Dad." Frank folded the letter and put it in his left breast pocket next to his heart and went back to pouring coffee. 3 weeks later, a second letter arrived. This one was not from Billy. The letter from the War Department came on a Thursday. Frank was in the kitchen again, measuring coffee grounds into the large pot when the mail clerk appeared in the doorway with an expression that Frank recognized before a single word was spoken. He took the envelope. He opened it. He read it. Billy Holloway had been killed in action at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, February 1943, during the first major American defeat in North Africa. Frank folded the letter. He put it in the same pocket as Billy's last letter. He turned back to the stove. He continued measuring coffee grounds, but his hands were shaking, and for the first time in his life, the coffee he poured missed the cup and spilled across the counter in a dark, spreading stain that he watched for several seconds before wiping it away. From that day forward, Frank carried a quiet anger inside him. Not the loud kind, not the kind that explodes and then passes. This was the cold kind, the heavy kind, the kind that sits on your chest like a stone every morning when you wake up and does not move until you fall asleep, and sometimes not even then. He still cooked. He still brewed coffee. He still served the men around him. But whenever someone mentioned North Africa, his jaw would tighten and his eyes would drop to the counter, and he would not speak again for a long time. But what Frank did not know, what he could not have imagined on those quiet mornings in the Camp Hearn kitchen, was that in 4 months he would be pouring coffee for the very men who had fought at Tunisia. And one of them, a man he had never met and whose name he did not yet know, would change the course of his life. Not with an apology, not with an explanation, but with a cup of coffee. And that single cup would travel further than either man could imagine. The convoy arrived on a hot afternoon in August. Frank stood at the kitchen door watching. The trucks stopped in the yard and one by one German soldiers stepped down onto Texas soil. They wore the faded uniforms of the Afrika Korps, bleached pale by the North African sun, and many of them were thin from weeks of transport, first by ship across the Atlantic and then by train through the American South. They blinked in the hard Texas light and looked around with eyes that carried both exhaustion and curiosity. The sky above them was enormous, wider and bluer than any sky most of them had ever seen, and the flat grassland stretching away from the camp in every direction was a landscape that belonged to another world entirely. Frank watched them and saw only one thing: the enemy. These men or men like them had fought in Tunisia, at Kasserine Pass, where Billy fell. Frank's fist tightened at his side. He stepped back into the kitchen and closed the door. But what Frank did not know was that the man pouring the enemy's coffee was also the man carrying a letter that said his son was never coming home. And the distance between those two truths was exactly the width of one kitchen counter. Over the next few days, as the prisoners settled into their barracks and the camp adjusted to its new population, Frank learned the routines. Under the Geneva Convention of 1929, prisoners of war were entitled to food rations equivalent in quality and quantity to those provided to the garrison troops guarding them. This meant that Frank the cook, who had lost his son to the war, was now required to feed the men who had fought on the other side of it. Every tray of food he placed in front of a German prisoner felt like a small betrayal. Every portion he measured felt like something stolen from Billy's memory. The first full day of the prisoner's arrival began with the smell of bacon. Frank stood at the stove before dawn, laying strips across the cast iron skillet, the same way he had done at Holloway's diner for 6 years. The fat popped and hissed, and the smoke curled upward and hung in the warm air near the ceiling. He cracked eggs into a second pan, the shells splitting cleanly in his practiced hands, and the whites spread across the hot metal with a sound like rain hitting a tin roof. Bread went into the oven. Butter was cut into squares and placed on metal plates, and the coffee brewed in the large pot on the back burner, its smell slowly overtaking everything else in the room, until the entire kitchen existed inside a cloud of dark, bitter warmth. When the prisoners filed in for their first breakfast, Frank watched their faces. Most of them looked at the food the way hungry men always look at food, with a directness that has nothing to do with manners and everything to do with need. But several of them paused when they reached the eggs and bacon. One man stared at the strips of bacon on his tray as if he had never seen anything like it. Another lifted a piece to his nose and inhaled before taking a bite, and the expression that crossed his face was not just satisfaction, it was disbelief. In the later years of the war in Europe, meat had become scarce. Many of these men had not eaten real bacon in months, some in years. And here it was sizzling and golden and piled on their trays as if it cost nothing at all. Frank noticed all of this. He noticed the way they ate slowly, almost reverently, and the way some of them looked up from their trays and glanced around the kitchen as if waiting for someone to take the food away. No one did. The food stayed, the coffee steamed, and the men ate until their trays were clean. But there was one prisoner Frank noticed before any of the others. Among the group that arrived that afternoon, there was a man who stood slightly taller than those around him. He was about 40 years old, with a kind of posture that did not bend even under obvious fatigue, and he had a habit that caught Frank's attention immediately. As the man walked past the kitchen building and on his way to the barracks, he lifted his head, drew a long, slow breath through his nose, tilted his head slightly to the left, and then said something in German to the man walking beside him. Both of them laughed quietly. Frank did not speak German, but he recognized that gesture. It was the reaction of a man evaluating the smell of coffee, not the way a hungry person smells food, the way a professional does it. The tilt of the head, the slow inhalation, the brief pause before judgment. Frank knew this because he did the same thing every morning himself. His first reaction was irritation. A German prisoner was judging his coffee in an American camp on Texas soil. Several days later, Frank overheard the translation. A guard named Corporal Eddie Novak, whose grandparents had emigrated from Bavaria and who spoke fluent German, told Frank what the prisoners had been saying about the coffee. They said it was thin. They said it was watered down compared to what they remembered from Europe. And one of them, the tall man Frank had noticed, said he had been a cafe owner in Hamburg before the war and could brew a better cup blindfolded. The man's name was Klaus Richter. Something shifted inside Frank when he heard that. Not compassion, not curiosity. Anger, a different kind of anger than the grief he carried for Billy. This was the anger of a craftsman whose work had been insulted. Holloway's Diner had served the best coffee in Hearne, Texas for 6 years. Ranchers drove 20 miles out of their way for that coffee. And now a German prisoner, a man who had fought for the enemy, was telling people it was weak. Frank decided something that night. He did not decide to be kind. He did not decide to forgive. He decided to prove Klaus Richter wrong. The next morning, when he brewed that coffee for the first time for both the guards and the prisoners, he would make it stronger than he had ever made it. Not for the Germans, for himself, for his pride, for the memory of every cup he had ever poured at Holloway's. That decision, made out of stubbornness and wounded pride, would become the first step on a road Frank never intended to walk. The morning came early. Frank was in the kitchen by 3:30, working in the yellow light of the single bulb measuring coffee grounds with the careful precision of a man who had done this 10,000 times before. 2 scoops per cup, water just off the boil, pour slow, stir once, let it settle. The smell began to rise from the pot as the grounds released their oils, and it spread through the kitchen in slow waves, dark and bitter and familiar. By the time the sky outside began to lighten, the aroma had escaped through the kitchen walls and crossed the open yard. It passed the guard post where the night shift was ending and the morning shift had not yet begun. It threaded through the gaps in the barracks doors and settled into the long wooden buildings where the German prisoners were beginning to wake. Some of them sat up on their cots and turned their faces toward the source of the smell, the way a man turns toward a window when the sun first hits it. Klaus Richter was the last to step outside. He walked slowly, deliberately, and as he crossed the threshold of the barracks into the open air, he did what Frank had seen him do on the first day. He lifted his head, drew a long breath through his nose, and tilted his head to the left. Then he said something to the man beside him in German. Corporal Novak, standing nearby, translated it later for Frank. Klaus had said that the coffee was brewed from Arabica beans, not Robusta. Medium roast, not dark. Drip method, not press. Moderate strength. No praise. No criticism. Just a professional assessment. And that somehow made Frank angrier than any insult could have. The prisoners lined up in the kitchen for breakfast. Metal trays slid along the wooden counter. Bread, butter, fried eggs, and at the end of the line, a metal cup of coffee. Frank stood at the last station pouring the coffee himself. He did not need to be there. He could have let the kitchen helpers handle it. But he wanted to see the face of every prisoner who received his coffee. He wanted to watch their reaction, especially the reaction of Klaus Richter. When Klaus reached the end of the line, Frank poured slower than he had for the others. The dark stream of coffee fell from the pot into the metal cup, and steam rose between the two men like a thin curtain that neither could see through clearly. Klaus looked at the cup, then he looked up at Frank. For the first time, the two men looked directly into each other's eyes. Frank set the pot down. Klaus took the cup with both hands, holding it the way a person holds something they intend to study rather than simply consume. Klaus sat down at a table near the center of the room. He lifted the cup, closed his eyes halfway, and inhaled the steam rising from the surface. Then he took the first sip, and then he went silent. That silence lasted about 5 seconds. But in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the small sounds of men eating and trays touching the table and guards talking in low voices near the wall, those 5 seconds felt much longer. The other German prisoners, the ones who had heard Klaus mock American coffee for days, turned to look at him. Klaus lowered the cup. His expression did not show delight or disgust. It showed something that Frank, watching from behind the counter, could not immediately identify. Then Klaus did something no one expected. He raised the cup again and took a second sip. Not a testing sip, a drinking sip. The difference was small, but anyone who understood coffee knew what it meant. One by one, the other prisoners at the table lifted their own cups and drank. No one spoke for several minutes. The smell of coffee filled the room. Steam rose from dozens of metal cups, and the military kitchen in the middle of Texas became for a brief moment the quietest place in the entire war. But Klaus did not go silent because the coffee was good or bad. The real reason would not be revealed for weeks, and when Frank finally learned the truth, it would change everything he believed about the man sitting at that table. After breakfast, Frank collected the cups. When he reached the spot where Klaus had been sitting, he picked up the cup and looked inside. It was completely empty. Klaus had drunk every last drop. In 6 years of running Holloway's Diner, Frank had learned that the way a person treats their cup of coffee tells you more about them than any words ever could. Weeks passed. Life in Camp Hearn settled into a rhythm that was shaped by the land and the heat and the slow turning of seasons in central Texas. The German prisoners worked during the day, harvesting cotton in the surrounding fields, repairing fences along the perimeter, clearing brush from the drainage ditches that ran between the barracks. The work was hard but not punishing, and the Texas sun treated everyone equally, guard and prisoner alike, baking the dust into their boots and darkening the skin on the backs of their necks. The meals became the markers of each day. Breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 5:30. Frank ran the kitchen with the same efficiency he had used at the diner, arriving before anyone else and leaving after the last pot was scrubbed. The mornings were his. He brewed coffee at 3:30 alone in the kitchen, and the smell spread through the camp by 4. By the time the breakfast line opened, the prisoners were already waiting, and the metal cups of coffee had become the one part of the routine that everyone, guards and prisoners alike, approached with something close to anticipation. On Sundays, when the work schedule was lighter, Frank sometimes made biscuits from scratch, the way his mother had taught him in the same town 30 years earlier. He mixed the flour and the lard and the buttermilk by hand, rolled the dough flat on the wooden counter, and cut circles with the rim of a tin cup. When the biscuits came out of the oven, golden and steaming and filling the kitchen with a smell that was older than the war and older than anyone in it, even the guards who had been stationed at the camp for months would pause in the doorway and breathe in. Frank noticed that Klaus always arrived early for meals. He always sat at the same table near the center of the room. He always held his coffee cup in a particular way, with both hands wrapped around the metal, and he always drank every drop. But beyond those small observations, Frank kept his distance. The anger had not left. It had only settled deeper below the surface, where it sat like a stone at the bottom of a well. Then Captain Vernon Hargrove arrived. Hargrove was 35, a logistics officer transferred to Camp Hearn from a supply depot in Louisiana. He was not the camp commander. That position belonged to Colonel Morrison, a career officer who believed in following the Geneva Convention to the letter. But Hargrove was in charge of supplies and budgets, which meant he controlled what came into the camp and how it was distributed. Hargrove had a reason for the way he saw the world, and that reason had a name. His younger brother, Lieutenant Daniel Hargrove, had been killed at Guadalcanal in November of 1942. Since that day, Hargrove carried a conviction that ran deeper than policy or regulation. He believed that every resource spent on enemy prisoners was a resource stolen from the American soldiers still fighting and dying on the front lines. He did not beat prisoners. He did not shout. He did not break rules. He was more dangerous than that. He used paperwork. He used budgets. He used the quiet machinery of bureaucracy to squeeze every unnecessary comfort out of the prisoners' daily lives. Hargrove was not evil. He was grieving. And grief, when it wears a uniform and carries a clipboard, can do more damage than cruelty ever could. And on a Tuesday morning in late October, he called a meeting in the kitchen and made an announcement. Starting the following week, coffee would be removed from the prisoner rations. The official reason was conservation of supplies for frontline troops. Prisoners would receive warm water or a grain substitute instead. Hargrove cited a directive from Washington about cost reduction and noted that the Geneva Convention required equivalent caloric intake, not identical menu items. Coffee, he said, was not a necessity. It was a luxury, and luxuries were for the men who had earned them. Frank stood in the kitchen and listened to the announcement in silence. Around him, the kitchen staff shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Hargrove left the room with his clipboard and his numbers and his certainty. Frank looked at the 200 cups on the counter. Tomorrow morning he would still brew coffee, but it would only be for the guards. The prisoners, the men who lined up early and held their cups and drank every drop, would receive nothing. Part of Frank agreed with Hargrove. Why should the enemy drink coffee when Billy would never drink anything again? Part of him felt the cold satisfaction of justice being served. Let them go without. Let them feel what it is like to have something taken from you. But another part of Frank, the part that had watched Klaus close his eyes over the steam of the first cup, the part that had seen dozens of men sit quietly at wooden tables and treat their morning coffee as if it were the last familiar thing left in their lives. That part felt something different, something he did not yet have a name for. This was the last morning they would share coffee before Captain Hargrove changed everything. But Frank Holloway did not yet know that Hargrove's decision would push him into the hardest fight of his life. A fight without weapons, without a clear enemy, and without a victory that belonged to anyone. That evening, a guard told Frank that Klaus had asked whether it would be possible to meet the cook to discuss methods of preparing coffee. Frank refused immediately. He did not want to speak with any German prisoner, least of all the one who had judged his coffee from the first breath. But that night, lying on his cot in the small room assigned to kitchen staff, Frank could not sleep. The guard had mentioned one more thing. When asked why he wanted to meet the cook, Klaus had answered in German, a sentence that the guard translated as follows: "Because his coffee reminds me of a morning I will never forget." Frank lay in the dark and turned that sentence over in his mind. A morning I will never forget. Which morning, why, and why did Frank's coffee bring it back? The answer to that question would come, but not from Klaus's voice. It would come from a letter written in German, folded to half the size of a palm, and slipped beneath the kitchen door on a night in October. And when Frank found someone to translate those words, he would finally understand why Klaus went silent on that first morning. Not because the coffee was good or bad, but because it reminded him of the brother who would never come home. If this story of two enemies finding something human over a cup of coffee matters to you, hit subscribe. Because what happens next, the choice Frank Holloway will make alone in the dark at 2 in the morning, will define the rest of his life. The first morning without coffee arrived the way most catastrophes do, quietly. Frank was in the kitchen by 3:30, same as always. He measured the grounds, he boiled the water, he brewed the pot. The smell rose and filled the room and drifted through the cracks in the walls and out across the yard, carried by the cool October air into every corner of Camp Hearn. It reached the guard posts. It reached the barracks. It reached the long wooden buildings where the German prisoners were waking on their cots, turning their faces toward the familiar scent the way flowers turn toward the sun. But this morning, when the breakfast line opened, the cups at the end of the counter were only for the guards. The prisoners received their trays with bread and butter and eggs, and at the end of the line, where the coffee had always been there, was a metal pitcher of warm water. Frank watched from behind the counter as the first group of prisoners reached the end of the line and looked at the pitcher. Most of them paused for a moment, glancing at the empty space where the cups used to be, and then moved on without a word. They were soldiers. They had survived this desert and the ocean crossing and the barbed wire. Warm water instead of coffee was not the worst thing that had happened to them. But Frank noticed the difference, not in what the prisoners said because they said nothing, in how the room felt. The kitchen had always carried a particular energy during the morning meal, a low hum of conversation and movement, and the small sounds of men beginning their day with something warm in their hands. That energy was gone. The room was quieter now. The prisoners ate faster. They did not linger at the tables the way they used to, holding their cups and talking in low voices, and sometimes laughing about things Frank could not understand. They finished their food and left. The guards still had their coffee. Frank could see them at the far tables lifting their cups, drinking without thinking about it, treating the coffee the way people treat things they have never been without. And across the room at the tables where the prisoners sat, there was only warm water in metal cups that did not steam, did not smell, did not remind anyone of anything. Klaus Richter sat at his usual table. His tray was in front of him. His right hand rested on the table beside the cup of warm water, and Frank noticed a small movement that he would not have caught if he had not been watching. Klaus's hand opened and closed once slowly, the fingers curling inward and then releasing, as if reaching for something that was not there. It was the gesture of a man whose body still expected a cup of coffee, even though his mind knew it would not come. Frank turned away. He told himself what he had been telling himself since Hargrove's announcement. These are the enemy. They do not need coffee. Billy does not need anything anymore. But every morning after that, when Frank brewed the pot and the aroma crept out under the kitchen door and into the cool air of the yard, he felt something he could not quite name. The prisoners could still smell it. Every morning it reached them, and every morning they received nothing. Frank, who had spent his life feeding people who had built his identity around the simple act of putting something warm and good in front of another person, understood, in a way that Hargrove never could, that letting someone smell what they cannot taste is a cruelty that no regulation forbids, but every decent man recognizes. 2 weeks after the coffee was cut, Frank noticed something unusual. Every evening after the last meal, Klaus and a small group of 5 or 6 prisoners gathered in the far corner of their barracks. Frank could see them from the kitchen window if he stood at the right angle and looked across the yard past the guard tower. They sat in a loose circle around a small wooden crate that someone had turned upside down to serve as a table, and each of them held a metal cup. At first, Frank assumed they were drinking water, but the way they held the cups was wrong. They cradled them close to their faces and leaned in towards something rising from the surface. Water from the evening meal would have been cold by then. Whatever was in those cups was warm. Frank watched for several nights before asking Corporal Novak to find out what was happening. The answer came back the next day, and when Frank heard it, he stood very still in the kitchen for a long time. Klaus Richter had been collecting the used coffee grounds from the kitchen trash. Every morning after Frank brewed the pot for the guards and dumped the spent grounds into the waste bin, Klaus or one of his men would retrieve them during the work detail that passed near the kitchen shed. They spread the damp grounds on a flat board behind the barracks and left them in the Texas sun until they dried. Then in the evening, Klaus would borrow hot water from the kitchen under the excuse of washing, pour it slowly through a piece of cloth filled with the dried grounds, and collect the thin brown liquid that dripped through into the cups waiting below. The result was barely coffee. It had almost no caffeine. The color was closer to weak tea than to anything Frank would recognize from his pot, but it carried just enough of the bitter smell, just enough of the dark, familiar taste to remind the men holding those cups of something they had lost. The prisoners called the corner of the barracks Das Kaffeehaus, the cafe. Every evening, Klaus stood behind the wooden crate and served each man a cup with the same quiet formality he must have used in Hamburg before the war, before the bombs, before everything that had brought him to a barracks in Texas holding recycled coffee grounds in a piece of torn cloth. He even wiped the surface of the crate with his sleeve before setting down the first cup the way a good barman wipes the counter before serving. The men who gathered there did not come for the taste. They came for the ritual. For 10 minutes each evening, sitting in a circle with warm cups in their hands, they were not prisoners. They were customers in a cafe that existed only in memory and in the stubborn refusal of one man to let his craft die. Frank understood what Klaus was doing, and he understood it not as an officer or a guard or even as an American. He understood it as a cook. Klaus was not stealing. He was not rebelling. He was not trying to undermine the rules. He was doing what every person in his profession does when the world takes away the tools. He was improvising. He was keeping his craft alive with whatever scraps the world left behind. Taking coffee away from a cafe owner was like taking a stove away from a cook. It would not kill the man, but it would kill something inside him that mattered more than comfort. Frank could have reported it. The collection of materials from the kitchen waste was technically a violation of camp procedures. One word to Hargrove and the operation would be shut down, the grounds confiscated, and Klaus possibly disciplined. Frank told himself he would think about it. He told himself he had not decided yet. But every evening when he looked out the kitchen window and saw the small circle of men in the corner of the barracks holding their cups of almost nothing and treating it like everything he found, that the report never quite made it from his mind to his mouth. Then the letter appeared. Frank found it on the kitchen floor early one morning, lying just inside the back door, as if someone had slipped it through the gap between the door and the frame during the night. It was a single sheet of paper folded small, the edges creased with the kind of care that suggested the person folding it had done so slowly and deliberately. The writing on the paper was in German, neat and compact, filling most of the page in dark pencil. Frank could not read German. He picked the letter up and turned it over. On the outside fold, in careful block letters, someone had written two words in English: for cook. He put the letter in his pocket and carried it through the morning routine, feeling its small weight against his leg as he brewed coffee and served breakfast and cleaned the counters. After the morning shift ended, he walked to the guard station and found Corporal Eddie Novak sitting on a bench outside smoking a cigarette in the late morning sun. Frank handed him the letter. "Can you read this?" Novak unfolded the paper and his eyes moved across the lines of German script. He read in silence for about a minute. Then he stopped. He lowered the paper to his lap. He read it again from the beginning, more slowly this time, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the words. Then he looked up at Frank with an expression that Frank had only seen once before on the face of the mail clerk who had brought him the letter from the War Department. "You should sit down before you hear this," Novak said. The letter was from Klaus Richter, but it was not a complaint about the coffee, and it was not a request to have it restored. It was an explanation of why Klaus had gone silent on the morning he took his first sip of Frank's coffee weeks ago in the kitchen at Camp Hearn. Before the war, Klaus wrote he had owned a small cafe in the Altona district of Hamburg. The cafe was called Richter's Cafe, and it sat on a narrow street near the harbor, where the sound of ships' horns drifted through the windows every morning. Klaus opened the doors at 5 o'clock each day, and the first customer was always the same person: his younger brother Wilhelm Richter, 20 years old, who sat at the table by the window and drank the first cup of coffee before the rest of the city was awake. The two brothers did not talk much during those early mornings. They simply sat together in the quiet of the cafe, listening to the harbor, waking up outside, sharing the kind of silence that only exists between people who do not need words to feel close. Wilhelm always said the same thing when he finished his cup: "Pour me another one, brother. Military coffee will never be this good." Then the war came. Wilhelm was conscripted and sent to the Eastern Front. The last cup of coffee the two brothers shared was on a gray morning in October of 1942. Wilhelm sat at his usual table by the window. Klaus poured the coffee. Wilhelm drank it, smiled, and said the same words he always said. Then he stood up, put on his coat, and walked out of the cafe and down the street toward the harbor. Klaus watched him from the window until he disappeared around the corner. He never saw his brother again. Wilhelm Richter was killed at the Battle of Stalingrad in February of 1943, the same month that Billy Holloway was killed at the Battle of Kasserine Pass. The same war, the same February, different sides, the same silence left behind. In July of 1943, 4 months after Wilhelm's death, the Allied bombing campaign known as Operation Gomorrah struck Hamburg. Over 10 days of bombing, much of the city was destroyed. Richter's Cafe, the small cafe on the street near the harbor, was burned to the ground. Klaus's wife survived but lost their home. Klaus, already captured in Tunisia and on his way to America by ship, did not learn what had happened until a Red Cross letter reached him weeks later at Camp Hearn. The letter to Frank continued. Klaus wrote that on the morning he first tasted Frank's coffee in the Camp Hearn kitchen, he did not go silent because the coffee was good or bad. He went silent because the smell of it, the particular bitterness of the Arabica beans brewed in a large pot and poured into a metal cup, was so close to the smell of his own cafe on those early mornings with Wilhelm that for a moment he was no longer in Texas. He was back in Hamburg. He was standing behind the counter at Richter's Cafe, and his brother was sitting at the table by the window, waiting for a second pour that would never come. "I did not speak," Klaus wrote, "because I was afraid that if I opened my mouth I would weep in front of my comrades. And a man does not weep over coffee. But it was not the coffee. It was the morning. It was the brother. It was everything that your cup reminded me I had lost." Novak finished translating. The two men sat in silence on the bench outside the guard station. The Texas sun was climbing higher, and the shadows of the guard towers were shortening across the dusty yard. Somewhere in the barracks, a prisoner was playing a harmonica, the notes thin and wandering in the warm air. Frank did not move. Inside his mind, two sentences collided with a force that felt physical. Billy, in his last letter from Tunisia. "Everything will be over soon, Dad." Wilhelm at the table by the window in Hamburg. "Pour me another one, brother. Military coffee will never be this good." Two young men, two sides of the same war, the same goodbye disguised as a joke about coffee, the same month, the same silence, the same empty chair. Frank took the letter from Novak's hands. He folded it carefully along the original creases. Then he reached into his left breast pocket, the pocket where he kept the letter from the War Department about Billy, and he placed Klaus's letter beside it. Two letters, two losses, the same pocket pressed against the same heart. Frank stood up. He walked back to the kitchen. He did not speak for the rest of the day. If this story of two fathers and two brothers, separated by a war but connected by a cup of coffee, has touched you, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because what happens next, the night Frank Holloway stands at a door at 2 in the morning with a decision that will define everything, is the moment this story becomes something you will never forget. But the letter did not change Frank Holloway overnight. He was a Texas man born in 1898, raised in a generation that measured character by silence and endurance, and the distance between feeling something and acting on it could take days or weeks to cross. He continued to cook. He continued to brew coffee only for the guards. He continued to watch the evening ritual of Das Kaffeehaus from the kitchen window. And he carried two letters in his pocket where there had been one. The first thing that changed was small. So small that only Klaus would have noticed. Instead of dumping the used coffee grounds into the main waste bin, where they were mixed with food scraps and ash, Frank began placing them in a separate bucket near the back door of the kitchen. He did not announce this. He did not look at anyone when he did it. He simply changed where he put the bucket and left the back door unlocked at night. The next morning, the bucket was empty. Klaus had taken the grounds. This silent arrangement continued for days. Frank left the grounds. Klaus collected them. Neither man acknowledged the exchange, but both of them knew, and in the quiet language of men who express themselves through actions rather than words, something had shifted between them. The first time they actually stood face to face was on an evening when Frank stepped out the back door to set down the bucket and found Klaus already there, waiting in the shadow of the building. The two men looked at each other. The light was fading, and the last orange glow of the Texas sunset caught the edge of the kitchen roof above them. Klaus's face was half in shadow. Frank's hands were still damp from washing the pots. The silence lasted longer than either of them expected. Then Klaus spoke. His English was limited, the words coming slowly and carefully, each one placed with the kind of deliberation that suggested he had practiced this sentence many times in the barracks before coming. "Your coffee, it is honest, like the man who makes it." Frank did not answer. He set the bucket on the ground, turned his back, and stepped toward the kitchen door. But before he closed it, he stopped. He did not turn around. He spoke to the door frame, to the night air, to the space between them, that was neither friendship nor hatred, but something without a name. "Tomorrow morning, back door, 0400, before anyone wakes up." It was the first invitation, and it was the beginning of something neither man could have predicted. They met the next morning in the dark kitchen at 4 o'clock. Frank brewed 2 cups of coffee from the fresh pot before the guard's supply was poured and set one on the counter near the door. Klaus entered quietly, picked up the cup, and stood on the opposite side of the counter from Frank. They did not sit together. They did not face each other directly. They stood at angles the way men stand when they are not yet sure whether the person in front of them is safe. They did not talk about the war. They did not talk about Billy or Wilhelm. They talked about coffee. Klaus described the European method: hotter water, longer extraction, finer grounds, pressure. Frank described what he called cowboy coffee, the Texas method: ground straight into the pot, bring to a boil, strain through cloth, drink it while it burns. Klaus raised his eyebrows at the boiling part and said that boiling destroyed the oils that carried the flavor. Frank said the flavor in Texas came from the strength, not the oils, and that any coffee you could see through was not coffee at all. They stood in the kitchen in the dark debating extraction methods while the rest of the camp slept, and for 10 minutes, neither of them was a prisoner or a cook or a man who had lost someone. They were two people who understood the same craft from different sides of the world, speaking the only language that did not require translation. Those meetings continued. Every morning at 4 before the camp woke, Frank and Klaus stood in the kitchen and shared a cup of coffee. The conversations remained small and practical. Types of beans, roasting temperatures, the correct ratio of water to grounds. Klaus explained that in Hamburg, before the shortages, he had sourced his beans from a trader near the harbor who imported them directly from East Africa. He described the way the beans looked when they arrived, green and raw and smelling faintly of earth, and the way the color changed as they roasted, shifting from green to gold to chestnut to the deep dark brown that meant the oils were just beginning to surface. Frank listened and found himself remembering the mornings at Holloway's diner when he would crack open a fresh bag of grounds and the smell would fill the entire room before he had even reached the pot. But within those conversations about coffee, other things passed between them without being named. When Klaus described the mornings at Richter's cafe, he was telling Frank about his life. When Frank described the regulars at Holloway's diner, he was telling Klaus about his. The coffee was the door. Everything else walked through it. But the story does not move in a straight line, and the hardest moment was still ahead. New prisoners arrived at Camp Hearn in late October. Among them were officers of higher rank and men whose loyalty to the regime had not softened during captivity. Within days, a faction formed inside the barracks. These men, the hardliners, began enforcing discipline among the prisoners who they believed had grown too comfortable, too friendly with the American guards. They saw cooperation as collaboration and kindness as weakness. The change was visible even from the kitchen window. Where the barracks had once been relaxed in the evenings, with men sitting outside on the steps playing cards or talking quietly, now there was a tension that showed itself in small ways. Prisoners who used to wave at the guards stopped waving. Men who had been friendly with each other now kept to smaller, tighter groups. And the corner of this barracks where Das Kaffee House operated every evening became a point of particular attention. Klaus was warned. A man he did not know well, a sergeant who had arrived with the new group, sat beside him at the evening meal and spoke in a low voice without looking at him. The message was simple. Stop the cafe. Stop talking to the American cook. Stop behaving as if this camp is a holiday and these Americans are your hosts. The sergeant reminded Klaus that there were men in the barracks who remembered what happened to collaborators and that the war was not over yet and that loyalty was not something a man could set aside because the coffee was good. Klaus did not respond. He finished his meal in silence and returned his tray to the counter. But that evening, Das Kaffee House did not open. The wooden crate remained under the bunk. The cloth filter stayed folded. The cups stayed stacked. And the men who had gathered there every evening for weeks sat on their cots, instead saying nothing, understanding without being told that something had changed. This was not fiction. It was history. In many German prisoner of war camps across America, the divide between those who rejected the ideology and those who still embraced it led to intimidation, beatings, and in some cases worse. Camp Hearn itself experienced internal tensions between the two factions that sometimes turned violent. The threat to Klaus was real, and it came not from the Americans, but from his own countrymen. At the same time, Hargrove noticed that the amount of coffee grounds being used for the guards' morning pot had increased. Frank had been using more grounds per pot than the standard measure called for, which meant the spent grounds in the waste bin retained more flavor than they normally would. It also meant the supply was being consumed faster. Hargrove noted the discrepancy in his weekly report. He did not act immediately, but he began watching the kitchen with the careful patience of a man who knows that numbers do not lie. Frank now faced pressure from two directions. Hargrove was tightening his grip on the kitchen. The hardliners were threatening Klaus. If Frank continued to help Klaus, he risked violating Hargrove's direct order about the coffee supply, and he risked putting Klaus in danger from within the German ranks. The safest choice, the logical choice, was to stop, to close the back door, to dump the grounds in the ash pile, to let the silent morning meetings disappear as if they had never happened. And on the night everything nearly broke, that is exactly what Frank decided to do. He sat alone in the dark kitchen after the evening shift, holding two letters in his hands. Billy's last letter with its hurried handwriting and its final line about everything being over soon. And Klaus's letter, with its careful German script and its story about a brother and a cup of coffee and a morning that would never come again. Frank read Billy's letter one more time. Then he set both letters on the counter and pulled a blank sheet of paper from the shelf. He began to write. The words came clearly and without hesitation. He wrote Klaus Richter's name. He wrote a description of the unauthorized collection of kitchen materials. He described the evening gatherings in the barracks. He noted the violation of camp procedures. He wrote it all in steady handwriting, with no crossing out and no uncertainty, the way a man writes when he has made a decision and wants to be done with it. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Frank picked up the report and walked out of the kitchen into the cold Texas night. The camp was silent. The guard towers stood dark against a sky full of stars, and the only light came from a single window in the administrative building where the overnight duty officer sat. Frank crossed the yard, his boots making soft sounds on the dry ground, and walked to the door of the logistics office where Hargrove kept his files. He reached for the handle, and then he heard it. From the direction of the prisoner barracks, very faint, almost lost in the distance, and the silence of the night, someone was singing. A German folk song. The melody was slow and shot a lullaby that drifted across the yard like smoke rising and falling in the still air. The voice was not strong and the words were not clear, but the tune was unmistakable. Frank stood with his hand on the door handle and listened. He knew that song. Not because he spoke German, not because he had heard it at Camp Hearn. He knew it because Billy had sung it once. Before the war, Billy had studied German at Texas A&M. He loved languages. He loved music. And one evening at Holloway's Diner while washing dishes after the last customers had left, Billy had started humming a melody that Frank did not recognize. Frank asked what it was. Billy laughed and said it was a German song. Brahms, a lullaby. Guten Abend, gute Nacht. Billy said it was beautiful, and he sang a few bars in his clear young voice while the dishwater cooled in the sink and the last light of the day faded through the diner windows. Now that same song was floating across the yard of Camp Hearn from the barracks where the German prisoners slept. And Frank Holloway stood in the dark with a report in his hand that would punish the man who might have been the one singing it. He looked down at the paper. He looked at the door. He listened to the song. Then slowly he began to tear the report, not in one motion. He tore it piece by piece, one strip at a time, as if he were tearing away something inside himself that he no longer wanted to carry. The pieces fell from his fingers onto the ground at his feet, pale scraps of paper on dark Texas dirt, and when the last piece dropped, Frank turned away from the door and walked back across the yard. In the kitchen, he sat down at the counter. He brewed 1 cup of coffee for himself, and on the back of Billy's last letter in the margin below, the words, "Everything will be over soon, Dad," Frank wrote a single line, "I almost became what they said we were." He sat with that sentence until the sky began to lighten. Then he stood up, washed his cup, and began preparing for the morning. The next day, Frank changed, not dramatically, not in a way that anyone besides Klaus would have noticed. He continued to brew coffee for the guards. He continued to follow the kitchen schedule. But the bucket of grounds appeared at the back door again, and this time Frank did not pretend it was an accident. He placed it there deliberately in full view of anyone who might pass by, and he left the back door unlocked. And the mornings at 4 o'clock resumed. Frank brewed 2 cups from the fresh pot before anyone else arrived. Klaus came to the back door. They stood on either side of the counter and talked about coffee, but now something else had entered the room, a quietness between them that was different from the careful distance of before, an understanding that did not require explanation. Klaus showed Frank how to adjust the water temperature to bring out the sweetness hidden beneath the bitterness of the beans. Frank showed Klaus the cowboy method of boiling the grounds twice to extract every last bit of strength. They debated and disagreed and sometimes laughed quietly in the dark, and the kitchen filled with the warmth of 2 different traditions meeting in the same pot. One morning, Klaus said something that was not about coffee. It was the only sentence he spoke that morning, and he said it slowly, 1 word at a time, as if he had been assembling it in his mind for days. "My brother, same month as your son. February, same war. Different side, same coffee. Never again." Frank did not answer. He poured more coffee into Klaus's cup, and the 2 men sat in the dark kitchen in silence until the sky turned gray and the first sounds of the camp waking reached them through the walls. That silence was the fullest either of them had ever known. It was the silence of two men who had found in each other the only person in the world who understood exactly what had been taken from them. Not because they were alike, not because they agreed, but because they had both sat across from someone they loved on a morning that turned out to be the last, and they had both poured a cup of coffee that the other person would never finish. But what Frank did not know was that Hargrove had already signed the inspection order, and what would happen in the days that followed would force Frank Holloway to choose between obedience and conscience, between the safety of following orders and the cost of doing what he knew was right. That choice, and everything it would destroy and everything it would build, was waiting for him just beyond the next sunrise. The inspection came on a Tuesday in early December of 1943. Frank heard about it the way most people in the camp heard about things Hargrove did. Not through an announcement or a meeting, but through the quiet movement of paperwork and the sudden appearance of soldiers walking through areas they did not normally visit. By mid-morning, a detail of 4 guards had entered the prisoner barracks with clipboards and begun a systematic search of every bunk, every shelf, every footlocker, and every corner of the long wooden buildings. The official reason was a directive from Washington requiring all prisoner of war camps to conduct periodic inventory assessments and ensure compliance with operational standards. The real reason was Hargrove. He had been watching the coffee supply numbers for weeks. He had noted the increase in grounds being used. He had observed that the waste bins behind the kitchen contained less residue than they should have. And though he did not yet know the full picture, he knew enough to suspect that something was happening with the coffee that his orders had not authorized. Frank was in the kitchen when the search began. He stood at the counter, slicing bread for the midday meal, and through the window he could see the guards moving between barracks with their clipboards. His hands continued working, but his mind was in the corner of barracks number 3, where a wooden crate sat upside down on the floor, and a piece of cloth hung from a nail on the wall, and a small collection of dried coffee grounds was hidden beneath a loose board. The search took most of the morning. Frank heard nothing for hours. He served the midday meal. He cleaned the kitchen. He wiped the counters. And then just after 1 o'clock, Corporal Novak appeared in the kitchen doorway with a face that told Frank everything before a single word was spoken. They had found it. The wooden crate, the cloth filter, the cups arranged in a careful row beneath the bunk nearest the corner, the dried grounds stored in a tin can with a lid made from a flattened piece of metal, and the notebook, a small notebook with a cover made from cardboard filled with Klaus Richter's handwriting. Page after page of notes in German documenting methods and measurements and ratios, as if the man had been running a research laboratory rather than a secret coffee operation in a prisoner of war barracks. Hargrove held the notebook as evidence of what he called unauthorized appropriation of camp materials, organization of unapproved prisoner activities, and what he described in his report as a pattern of covert behavior suggesting potential resistance. The language was careful and bureaucratic, the kind of language that turns a man making coffee from garbage into a man committing an act of defiance against the United States military. Klaus Richter was removed from the general barracks and placed in the isolation building on the far side of the compound. The isolation building was a smaller structure separated from the main barracks by 50 yards of open ground. It had narrow windows and a single door that locked from the outside. It was not a punishment cell in the traditional sense. The Geneva Convention prohibited cruel treatment, but it was a place apart, a place where a man sat alone with nothing but the walls and his own thoughts, and for a man who had spent his life surrounded by the smell of coffee and the sound of conversation in a warm room, it was a kind of silence that had weight. Frank heard the news while preparing the evening meal. He set down his knife. He stood still for a moment looking at nothing, his hands flat on the counter. Then he did something he had never done in all his months at Camp Hearn. He untied his apron, hung it on the hook by the stove, and walked out of the kitchen in the middle of his shift. He crossed the yard in the fading afternoon light. The shadows of the guard towers stretched long and thin across the ground. The air was cool, carrying the faint smell of dust and dry grass from the fields beyond the fence. Frank walked with the kind of steady, unhurried pace that men use when they have made a decision and are not interested in being stopped. The guard at the isolation building straightened when Frank approached. Kitchen staff did not have authorization to visit this part of the camp. Frank said 4 words, "I need Colonel Morrison." The guard hesitated. Frank waited. The guard sent a runner to the administrative building. While he waited, Frank stepped to the side of the isolation building and looked through the narrow window. Inside, in the dim light that filtered through the small opening, Klaus Richter sat on the floor with his back against the wall. His knees were drawn up. His hands rested on them, palms down. There was no cup in his hands, no notebook, no wooden crate, no cloth filter, nothing. Just a man sitting on a wooden floor in an empty room, and for the first time since Frank had known him, Klaus did not look like a cafe owner or a professional or a man with opinions about extraction methods and roasting temperatures. He looked like what the war had actually made him, a prisoner, alone with nothing. Frank turned away from the window and waited for the colonel. The meeting took place in Morrison's office, a small room in the administrative building, with a desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet, and an American flag standing in the corner. Colonel Morrison sat behind the desk. Captain Hargrove stood to the left, holding his clipboard and the confiscated notebook. Frank stood in front of the desk, the lowest-ranking man in the room by a considerable distance, wearing his kitchen uniform with flour still on his sleeves and the smell of bread still on his hands. Morrison looked at Frank the way senior officers look at enlisted men who have interrupted their afternoon, with patience that had a limit. "Sergeant Holloway, you requested this meeting. Say what you came to say." Frank did not raise his voice. He did not make emotional appeals. He did not mention Billy or Klaus or the letters in his pocket or the mornings at 4 o'clock or the sound of a lullaby drifting across the yard at 2 in the morning. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has spent his life solving problems with his hands and has learned that the simplest tools are usually the strongest. He made 3 points. The first was legal. The Geneva Convention of 1929, Article 11, required that prisoner rations be equivalent in quality and quantity to those of the garrison troops. The guards at Camp Hearn received coffee every morning. The prisoners did not. This was not a matter of interpretation. It was a direct violation. Frank stated this plainly without accusation, as if he were reading a recipe rather than challenging a superior officer. The second was strategic. The International Committee of the Red Cross conducted periodic inspections of all prisoner of war camps. If the next inspection revealed a discrepancy in rations between guards and prisoners, the report would be sent to Geneva, and the consequences would ripple outward in ways that Hargrove's supply budget could not measure. For every cup of coffee denied to a German prisoner in Texas, there was an American soldier sitting in a German prison camp whose ration might be reduced in retaliation. The Geneva Convention worked in both directions. It was not charity, it was protection. The third point was personal, and Frank delivered it in the same calm, measured voice he had used for the first 2, though the effort it cost him showed only in the way his hands pressed flat against his thighs to keep them from shaking. "My son Billy Holloway was killed at Kasserine Pass in February of this year. I have every reason to hate every man in this camp. I have thought about it every day since the letter arrived. But if Billy had been captured instead of killed, I would want to believe that someone on the other side would give my son a cup of coffee in the morning. Not because Billy deserved it, not because the enemy owed him anything, but because the man who pours the coffee is the one who has to live with what he did or did not do. And I would rather live as the man who gave it than the man who took it away." The room went silent. Hargrove's jaw tightened. Morrison's expression did not change, but his eyes stayed on Frank for a long moment before he spoke. "Captain Hargrove, the notebook that was confiscated from the prisoner. Do you have it?" Hargrove handed the notebook across the desk. Morrison opened it. He turned the pages slowly, reading the German text with the careful attention of a man who understood the language. Morrison had served in Germany before the war, attached to the American embassy in Berlin during the early 1930s, and his German was fluent enough to read what Klaus had written. The notebook was not what Hargrove's report described. It was not a record of covert resistance or a manual for unauthorized operations. It was a journal. Klaus had written about coffee, yes, methods, temperatures, ratios. But between the technical entries, there were other things, memories of the cafe in Hamburg, descriptions of regular customers who came every morning and ordered the same drink without being asked, the sound of ships in the harbor, the way the light fell through the window at 5 o'clock in winter when the streets were still dark and the only warmth in the world came from the cup on the table. And on several pages near the middle, a series of entries about Wilhelm, about the last morning, about the cup that was never finished. About the smell of coffee that meant his brother was still there, and the silence that came after he was not. Morrison closed the notebook. He looked at Hargrove. Then he spoke. Captain, restore the coffee ration for all prisoners effective tomorrow morning. Release Richter from isolation. Return this notebook to him. And do not confiscate personal journals again. Geneva Convention Article 18. Personal belongings. Hargrove stood at attention. His face was tight. His eyes did not move from the wall behind Morrison's head. He said 2 words. Yes, sir. Then he turned and left the room. And though Frank would never know it, Hargrove paused for a moment in the hallway outside the office and pressed his hand against the wall. And in that brief private moment, the logistics officer who had built his grief into a system of numbers and regulations felt something crack inside the architecture of his certainty. He thought of Daniel. He thought of a morning on Guadalcanal that his brother had described in his last letter. And he walked back to his office and sat down and did not move for a very long time. Frank remained standing in front of the desk. Morrison looked at him for a moment, then said, Holloway, tomorrow's coffee. Make it strong. Frank nodded once. Always do, sir. He walked back to the kitchen as the last light of the afternoon faded behind the guard towers. He tied his apron back on. He finished preparing the evening meal, and he set out 200 cups on the counter, one by one, the metal ringing softly against the wood as each cup found its place in the long straight line. The next morning was different. Frank did not need an alarm. His body knew the hour the way it always had. 3:30. The kitchen was cold and the pot was waiting, and the grounds measured themselves in his hands from memory. But when the water boiled and the steam rose and the smell began to build, it carried something new. Not just coffee, something heavier and lighter at the same time. The weight of a decision made in an office by a man who read a journal and understood what it meant. The echo of a sentence spoken by a cook who had every reason to say nothing and chose to speak. And the quiet return of something that 200 men had lost and were about to find again on their trays at the end of the breakfast line. But before the camp woke, before the guards arrived for their shift, before the first light of the Texas dawn reached the kitchen windows, there was a sound at the back door. Frank turned. Klaus Richter stood in the doorway. He was thinner than he had been a week ago. His eyes carried the particular fatigue of a man who has spent days alone in a room with nothing to do but remember. But he stood straight the way he always did, and his hands hung at his sides, open and still. Frank reached behind him and picked up a cup of coffee from the counter. He held it out. Klaus stepped forward and took it. Then Frank picked up his own cup. They stood on either side of the counter, and they drank in silence while the sky outside slowly changed from black to gray to the first pale gold of sunrise. Klaus spoke first. His English had improved over the months, though the words still came carefully, each one chosen as if it cost something to say. In Hamburg, before the war, I opened my cafe at this hour. 5 o'clock. First cup was always for Wilhelm. Frank kept his eyes on the window where the light was growing. Holloway's Diner, he said. 4:30. First cup was always for Billy. Nothing else was said. They finished their coffee. Klaus set his cup on the counter and walked back toward the barracks. Frank washed both cups, placed them on the shelf, and began preparing for the morning meal. Outside, the camp was waking. The scent of fresh coffee reached every building in the compound for the first time in weeks, and the prisoners stepped out of their barracks and lifted their faces to the morning air and breathed in what they recognized. In the breakfast line, when the first prisoner reached the end of the counter and saw the row of steaming metal cups waiting there, he stopped for a moment. The man behind him stopped too, and for a few seconds the line stood still as the prisoners looked at the cups and understood that something had been given back. Then the line moved again, and the cups were lifted, and the kitchen filled with the sounds of a morning that felt for the first time in a long time like it belonged to everyone. If this story of a cook who chose mercy and a prisoner who never forgot it means something to you, share it with someone. Because the final part of this story, the part that happens 50 years later, is the part that no one could have predicted. And it is the part you will remember long after the screen goes dark. Months passed. The war continued beyond the fences of Camp Hearn, but inside the camp, the days settled into a rhythm that was shaped by small routines and quiet understandings. Frank brewed coffee every morning. Klaus came to the back door at 4. They stood together in the kitchen and talked about beans and water and the proper way to pour, and sometimes they did not talk at all. and the silence between them was comfortable in the way that silence can only be between people who have earned it. Spring came to Central Texas in 1944, and the fields around the camp turned green, and the prisoners who worked the cotton harvest through the previous autumn were now clearing land and mending equipment for the season ahead. Frank began growing herbs in a small patch of dirt behind the kitchen, rosemary and thyme, and a stubborn row of peppers that fought the Texas heat and won. Klaus, on his morning visits, would sometimes bring a suggestion from his own knowledge of European cooking, and Frank would try it in the next day's meal without telling anyone where the idea came from. The food at Camp Hearn quietly improved, and the prisoners noticed, and the guards noticed, and no one asked questions because the kitchen had always been Frank's domain, and no one questioned a cook whose biscuits could silence a room. The war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, 1945. The news reached Camp Hearn by radio, and Frank heard it standing in the kitchen, holding a pot of coffee that he had just finished brewing. Outside, he could hear the guards cheering and the sound of someone firing a rifle into the air in celebration. In the barracks, the prisoners received the news with a different kind of silence. For them, the end of the war meant something complicated. It meant going home. But home for many of them was a country that had been bombed and divided and occupied, and the word home no longer meant what it had meant when they left. In the months that followed, the prisoners were processed for repatriation. Groups left the camp in stages, loaded onto trucks and driven to the coast and placed on ships bound for a Germany that most of them would not recognize. The barracks emptied slowly, and the kitchen served fewer meals each week, and the camp began to feel like a place that was already becoming a memory. Klaus Richter's group was scheduled to leave on a morning in late September of 1945. The night before, Frank did not sleep. He sat in the kitchen in the dark when he had sat on many nights before, and he thought about what was ending. At 3:30 in the morning, he brewed 2 cups of coffee. He set them on the counter. And when the back door opened and Klaus stepped inside for the last time, neither man was surprised to find the other waiting. They sat across from each other at the wooden counter. The kitchen was dark except for the single bulb above the stove. The coffee steamed between them, and for a long time the only sound was the soft ticking of the metal cups cooling in the morning air. Klaus reached into his pocket and took out a folded piece of paper. He opened it and placed it on the counter between them. It was a drawing done carefully in pencil on a scrap of paper that had been smoothed and flattened many times. The drawing showed the front of a small building, a door, a window, a sign above the door that read Richter's Cafe. It was the cafe in Hamburg drawn from memory as it had looked before the bombs destroyed it. Klaus pointed to the sign in the drawing. Then he looked at Frank and spoke in the slow, careful English that he had built word by word over 2 years of mornings in this kitchen. When I rebuild, if I rebuild, the sign will be different. Frank looked at the drawing. How Richter and Holloway. Frank shook his head. You do not need to do that. Klaus set his cup down on the counter. He looked at Frank with an expression that carried the weight of every morning they had shared, every cup they had poured, every silence they had earned. You gave me coffee when you had every reason to pour it on the ground. You did not do it because I deserved it. You did it because you are the man who deserves to give it. I will not forget, and the sign will remember. Frank did not answer. He lifted his cup. Klaus lifted his. The 2 metal cups met in the air between them with a small, clear sound that rang once in the quiet kitchen and then faded into the silence of the last morning they would share in Camp Hearn, Texas. They drank. They finished. They set the cups down. Klaus stood. He folded the drawing and placed it in Frank's hand, closing Frank's fingers around it, the way a person closes someone's hand around a gift that must not be refused. Then he walked to the back door and stepped outside into the darkness before dawn. Frank stood in the kitchen doorway and watched. The truck was already waiting in the yard, its engine idling. Klaus climbed aboard with the other prisoners in his group. The truck pulled forward. It passed through the gate. It turned onto the dirt road that led away from Camp Hearn. And Frank watched it until the taillights disappeared behind the long flat line of the Texas horizon, swallowed by the same endless country that had held them both for 2 years. Frank went back inside. He washed the 2 cups. He placed them on the shelf. And he began brewing coffee for the morning meal as if the day were any other day, because that is what men like Frank Holloway do when the world changes around them. They go back to work. In 1947, Frank returned to Hearne, Texas, and reopened Holloway's Diner. The bacon was the same. The coffee was the same. The regulars came back older now and sat in the same seats and ordered the same breakfast and complained about the same things they had always complained about. On the counter next to the cash register, Frank placed a small framed photograph. It was the only picture taken of him at Camp Hearne. In the photograph, two men stood in front of the kitchen building, each holding a metal cup of coffee. The man on the left was Frank. The man on the right was Klaus. Neither was smiling, but they stood close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Customers sometimes asked about the photograph. Frank always gave the same answer. A friend from the war. He never said more. And the regulars who knew Frank well enough to understand that some answers are complete, even when they sound unfinished, never pressed him further. In 1952, a postcard arrived at Holloway's Diner from Hamburg, Germany. On the front was a photograph of a small cafe on a narrow street near a harbor. The sign above the door read, Richter und Holloway Kaffeehaus seit 1952. Klaus had kept his promise. On the back of the postcard, written in careful English, was a single line. First cup every morning, 4:30 for Billy and Wilhelm. Frank placed the postcard on the counter next to the photograph. And from that day forward, every morning at 4:30, before the diner opened, before the first customer walked through the door, Frank poured 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for the empty chair across the counter. He never explained this to anyone. The regulars noticed, but did not ask. In small towns in Texas, men are allowed their rituals without interrogation. Years passed. The diner aged the way good things age slowly and with character. The wooden counter developed a smooth groove where thousands of elbows had rested. The cast iron skillets turned black with decades of seasoning. The coffee pot was replaced 3 times, but the recipe never changed. And every morning 2 cups. One full, one untouched. The steam rising from both and disappearing into the air above the counter, where a photograph and a postcard stood side by side like sentries guarding a story that only 2 men had ever fully known. Margaret Holloway was born in 1965, the granddaughter Frank never expected but loved. In the quiet, steady way, he loved everything. She grew up in the diner learning to crack eggs before she learned to ride a bicycle, and by the time she was 10, she could brew a pot of coffee that Frank himself admitted was nearly as good as his own. She asked about the photograph once when she was 8. Frank told her it was a friend from the war. She asked about the 2 cups of coffee once when she was 12. Frank said it was a promise. She did not ask again because she had inherited her grandfather's understanding that some things are known by being witnessed, not by being explained. In 1973, Frank Holloway passed away at the age of 75. He died on a Tuesday morning, which his family later noted was the same day of the week he had received both of the letters that changed his life. He died in the diner in the early hours before opening, sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee in front of him and the photograph of 2 men and 2 cups standing beside the cash register where it had stood for 26 years. The second cup, the one for the empty chair, was full and still warm when Margaret found him. In his will, he left the diner to Margaret with one condition written in his own hand at the bottom of the document. Keep the photograph on the counter and every morning pour 2 cups. Margaret kept the promise. She took over the diner at 23, and every morning at 4:30, she unlocked the front door, walked to the counter, and poured 2 cups of coffee before doing anything else. The regulars who had known Frank saw her do it and understood, even if they did not know the details, that the ritual was not hers to change. New customers who noticed the untouched cup sometimes asked about it. Margaret gave the same answer her grandfather had given. A promise. And like her grandfather, she never said more. In 1989, Klaus Richter passed away in Hamburg at the age of 86. His son Thomas Richter took over the cafe. Thomas had grown up in the small kitchen behind the counter, learning to grind beans and steam milk and pour with the steady hand that his father had taught him. He knew the story. He had heard it many times, always told in the same quiet way, always ending with the same sentence. The sign remembers. Thomas kept the sign, Richter and Holloway, and every morning at 4:30 he poured 2 cups and set them on the counter before the cafe opened. One for Billy, one for Wilhelm. He did not know their faces. He had never been to Texas. But he knew their names the way a person knows the words of a prayer learned in childhood, by heart, without question. In 1997, Margaret Holloway, 32 years old, traveled to Europe for the first time. She had saved for years, closing the diner for 2 weeks in October, which was the quietest month in Hearn and the month her grandfather had always spoken about with a particular softness, though she had never understood why. She had no particular plan for Germany. She went because something inside her, something she could not name, told her that the answer to the 2 cups of coffee was somewhere across the ocean in a city she had never visited, on a street she did not know existed. Margaret arrived in Hamburg on a rainy afternoon in October. She walked through the streets near the harbor, looking at the old buildings and the new ones built where the old ones had been destroyed, and she listened to the sound of ships' horns in the distance, and the way the rain fell on the cobblestones, and the voices of people passing by, speaking a language she did not understand. She turned a corner into a narrow street in the Altona district, and she walked slowly, reading the signs above the doors of the shops and restaurants that lined both sides. Halfway down the street, she stopped. Above the door of a small cafe, a wooden sign hung from an iron bracket. The paint was slightly faded by decades of Hamburg rain, but the letters were clear. Richter and Holloway. Margaret read the sign. She read it again. Holloway, her name, her grandfather's name, the name of a diner in a small town in Texas where 2 cups of coffee were poured every morning for a chair that was never occupied. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The cafe was small and warm. The air smelled of coffee, dark and bitter, and so deeply familiar that Margaret's chest tightened before she understood why. It was the same smell. The same smell that filled Holloway's diner every morning at 4:30. The same smell that had been the first thing she breathed every day of her working life. The same smell that she had always associated with her grandfather, and his silence, and his steady hands, and his 2 cups on the counter. Wooden tables lined the walls. A counter ran along the back, and on the wall beside the counter, in a simple frame, hung a photograph, black and white. 2 men standing in front of a kitchen building, each holding a metal cup. The man on the left she recognized immediately. It was her grandfather, decades younger, with the same jaw and the same steady eyes that she remembered from her childhood. The man on the right was someone she had never seen, but who stood close enough to her grandfather that their shoulders nearly touched. It was the same photograph. The same photograph that stood on the counter of Holloway's diner in Hearn, Texas. The same photograph she had dusted every morning for 9 years. And here it was hanging on the wall of a cafe in Hamburg, Germany, 6,000 miles from home. A man emerged from behind the counter. He was in his mid-40s with dark hair and a calm expression, and hands that moved with the practiced ease of someone who had spent his life making coffee. He looked at Margaret. Then he looked at the photograph on the wall. Then he looked back at Margaret. He did not ask her name. He did not need to. The resemblance was clear, written in the shape of her face and the way she stood in the doorway, the same way her grandfather had stood in 1,000 doorways before her. Thomas Richter reached behind the counter without a word. He took down 2 cups. He filled them from the pot that sat on the stove, the same position where every pot had sat in that cafe since 1952. He placed 1 cup in front of Margaret. He kept the other for himself. And he said in English that carried the accent of his father and the precision of a sentence that had been passed down like a family prayer. "First cup, 4:30, for Billy and Wilhelm." Margaret picked up the cup. The coffee was hot. The steam rose around her face, and the smell was so close to the smell of her grandfather's kitchen at 4:30 in the morning that for a moment she was not in Hamburg. She was in Hearn, Texas. She was 8 years old. She was standing beside her grandfather in the dark kitchen of the diner, watching him pour 2 cups of coffee before dawn, one for himself and one for the empty chair. And she was asking him who the second cup was for, and he was looking at her with those steady eyes and saying, "A promise." She understood now. After all these years standing in a cafe in Hamburg that carried her family's name on its sign, she finally understood who the second cup was for. It was not for Billy. Billy had been gone since February of 1943. It was for Klaus. For the mornings at 4 o'clock in the Camp Hearn kitchen. For the 2 men who stood on opposite sides of a counter in a war and found in the space between them something that neither country nor conflict could take away. For a promise made over a metal cup in a dark kitchen before dawn, a promise that said, "I will remember this morning for the rest of my life, and so will the sign above my door." Margaret drank the coffee. Tears ran down her face. The coffee was hot and bitter and strong, and it tasted like every morning she had ever known. Thomas Richter stood behind his counter and watched her, and he did not speak because some things do not need words. They only need 2 cups and the willingness to pour. The cafe called Richter on Holloway still stands on a narrow street in the Altona district of Hamburg, near the harbor where the sound of ships' horns drifts through the windows in the early morning. And every day at 4:30, before the cafe opens its doors to the first customers of the morning, 2 cups of coffee are poured and placed on the counter. One for Billy, one for Wilhelm. 2 cups that no one drinks. But every morning they are filled, because there are promises that do not need the person who made them to still be alive. They only need someone willing to pour. And somewhere in a small town in Texas, in a diner that still opens at 5 in the morning, there is a photograph on the counter next to the cash register. 2 men, 2 cups, one kitchen. One morning that turned out to be the beginning of everything. If you have someone in your life whose coffee you remember someone, whose morning you shared before the world changed, then you already understand this story. And if you have stayed with here until the end, then you know that some promises are not kept with words. They are kept with coffee, 1 cup at a time, every morning, for as long as someone is willing to pour. Thank you for spending this time here. If stories like this matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue finding them. Because somewhere in the world right now, there is always a cup of coffee waiting to remind us that even enemies can share a morning.